So, ladies and gentlemen, officially, composer, conductor, pianist, Carrick. Thank you for coming out. I think it's really nice that at the beginning of tonight, Amelia have pointed this out, but I think it's really great that a concert series called Light and Dark is beginning basically on an equinox and have kind of this one day when there's equal parts light and dark. And I think it's interesting and fitting that we got 3 pieces by you tonight, but I think kind of covering both light and dark in kind of very different ways. I know that the piece we just heard and the piece we're about to hear are both really influenced by Albert Camus.
That's right.
And I think it'd be really interesting just to get your take on the connection with those 2 pieces with him and his stories, and particularly with the how they connect with the light and the sun.
Mm-hmm. Well, the piece you heard, La scène miniature, is based on the famous scene from Camus' L'Étranger. The famous scene where they're on the beach and he returns and he sees the stranger, and we know what happens at that point. It's the the pivotal point in that novel and of human existence, if you read that far into it. But the scene is amazing because if you remember, the scene actually begins, there's the sun and it's bright, it's noon and it's sweaty and it's hot and the sand is there and the ocean is there. And there's the stranger's friend who's actually playing out-of-tune flute, very high flute, and he's only playing 3 notes and he's cycling through them. That's how the scene begins. And it's the only reference to music in the entire novel. So I took those 3 notes, and I thought instead of using a flute, I'd really put in the piccolo, which is so different from the cello, and start to introduce those quarter tones and get those glissando and really make it as unclassical as possible. And the piccolo basically keeps the narrative of the piece. It's really a theatrical scene. And the cello is free to comment on that, so they don't interact as much as they cohabitate, and they're in interdependence.
And then the piece we're about to hear, Pas du Soleil, is it from the same scene, that same story?
It is,
yeah.
Yes.
But I like, I never studied French, and so my translation of that is bad, but what I've been able to pick up based on the story and what I think, basically the sun made me do it. Is that kind of
that's his explanation. And when he's in front of in his trial, they said, well, why did you kill him? And he said, it was because of the sun. And nobody really understands that, except we all kind of do understand that when you read that scene, that makes sense on this kind of very fundamental way. It's not explainable or anything like that, but there's something about the blinding quality of the sun and the way he describes it. And in the flow trio, it's the culminating work of my flow cycle, where there are solos and a duo, and this is the first piece where chamber music happens. And the 3 instruments come together, each of the instruments are virtuosically written for, but they're not solo parts anymore. They're completely intertwined in chamber music, and the piece literally ends with that moment of the book and the blinding quality, the very end of the piece, which we'll hear.
Yeah, so since you mentioned this idea of flow, I know that we might as well just briefly hit on this because it seems like a really important piece of your thinking about music and your thinking about writing. Maybe could you just say a bit about what that means to you, how you interpret the idea of flow, if it's really if it's this kind of intense focus in your writing process, or if there's something beyond that, and how it's impacted these pieces we're hearing tonight?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's been interesting for me in many different phases in my life. I mean, I think we all want to be in flow, and we all, figure out ways to be in flow. And then when I read Csikszentmihalyi's book, where he actually gives scientific explanation of the criteria for being in flow, and how do you, when you get out of flow, how do you get back into flow? And I had never read somebody actually articulate those things. It was mind-blowing. And I started thinking about how to actually come up with compositional techniques along the same lines as those techniques. So I'm not actually creating flow in my music as much as using flow principles to trigger my own musical ideas.
Yeah, I think composers and artists, of any kind of creative person understands, like when you get in that space, it's sometimes very difficult to articulate what it means, and particularly when you read other people's takes on what that means. But yeah, so those are two pieces I think are really interesting takes on the sun and on light. But this other piece, this brand new piece, this new commission, Prisoner Cinema, I think is very much an interesting take on the dark.
It's a very dark piece.
This is, I mean, part of the inspiration here, if I remember right, has to do with solitary confinement. Is that fair, or is that?
A little bit, yes. The premise is that, yeah. The prisoner's cinema is this phenomenon where people who've been in solitary confinement for many days or weeks and do not see anything but the same color. And it also exists with people who meditate, either, in all sorts of ways. They report flashes of images coming out of nowhere. But what's interesting is those flashes of images don't have specific details, or else sometimes they have multiple details or conflicting details. And so for me it was interesting to get into how we perceive images, and how we perceive images in a flash. That's a really tiny moment in time, and that means a lot when you're dealing with music.
Yeah, and we're going to have some images with that piece tonight, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so where did those images come from? What can you tell us about them?
Well, I've been working with audio-visual integration for many years, and my premise has always been to integrate fully moving image and sound and time, and find a way for them to counterpoint with each other. Because we live in a visual dominant culture, it's very easy for the music to really try to explain what we see in the images. But I'm looking for ways to have the images kind of follow the music somehow, and then at another point the images will take over and the music is going to be creating this real intermodal experience that you don't get from just listening to the music, and you don't get it from just looking at the images. So this is the first time I've done still images. These are photographs that I took.
And do these have, these photographs, were they inspired directly from things you've heard about these prisoners' visions?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was looking for a long time trying to figure out what images to use for this piece, yeah. And it finally happened this summer. I got all the images I needed.
That's great. I think it's always really, really interesting and helpful in certain kinds of pieces like this to have some images to go along with them. I know that's been really important in a lot of the work you've done over the years. So I'm sure that everybody's anxious to hear these last few pieces, and just Rick, thanks again for coming out. It's been really great to have you here and to hear your music. So many pieces all at once.
Oh, thank you very much, and I really appreciate the invitation from Mary and Leah and Amelia, and it's great to see you, Jim. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.